This is the second episode of the Outlanders Journey podcast. My name is Jay. As usual, I'm the author of the Outlanders Journey.
And I'm Kat. I am the narrator, and I am happy to be here to discuss the next segment of the story today.
Woohoo! Yes, that's what we're here for. Yes, so we are going to be going over chapters 9 through 25 of Level 0. If you aren't caught up to the final chapter of Level 0, then now is your chance to do so. You can also listen to the first episode of our podcast. I'll have links for all of these things wherever you listen. So we're going to be spoiling everything. So make sure you know what's going on, because otherwise I feel like you probably can't keep up.
Yeah, this is the spoiler zone
Yes,
for anyone concerned.
exactly. We don't really keep things spoiler free here. Before we get started, though, I'm going to go over really quick some housekeeping. We have written chapter releases resuming every Tuesday. I took a short little break in February.
Mm-hmm.
Currently, we're releasing level 4, which, if anyone's familiar with D&D's tier systems, level 4 is the end of tier 1. And it's not really relevant to how we're doing, but tiers are meant to be to help like dungeon masters know like the difficulty levels to set their, combats and stuff. But for my purposes, I think it's useful to use the tiers as like, if the Outlanders Journey was like a book series or something like that, each tier could be considered a book.
Mm-hmm.
So end of level 4 is end of book 1, that kind of thing. So we're approaching a really good sort of ending spot pretty soon in the written chapter releases. One like small thing I'm really happy about is it's currently early spring and level 4 is happening during their early spring, so I'm glad the timing of that worked out.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if you would rather just keep up with Kat's audio releases, which I totally understand, her voice is much, much more engaging to listen to, they will be released every Thursday on YouTube. We're releasing 2 chapters a week roughly. And then at every few chapters, I'll bundle up a few chapters together and I'll release sort of the bulk chapters on Spotify and Anchor. So you can listen to a bunch of chapters all at once over there if you want to.
Yes, binge listen to the story.
Yes. Last little thing is Wizards of the Coast has announced their 1D&D, which from what I'm reading about feels kind of like tweaks to the 5th edition system. So it's like a 5.5e, but they're insistent on calling it 1D&D, whatever. It is raising the question of whether or not the Outlanders Journey system should pour over to the new system. I have given it a little thought. I looked over at their playtest material. At this point, some of their changes is already affecting the story that's been released so far. So, if I pour over, it's going to get a little bit complicated with certain things that are already part of the released story. So for the time being, not going to change over to 1D&D once it's released. I don't see myself doing that, but I don't know. Wizards is weird sometimes. I'm really hoping that they won't force people to change the new system. I think that's going to piss off a lot of other campaigns that are happening as well. So
Mm-hmm.
hopefully they won't do that. Okay, that's all we have for housekeeping. Let's dive in. I don't want to waste any more time on other stuff. So let's jump over to the new chapters, 9 through 25. I feel like one thing I really wanted to hit on with these chapters is like, the early chapters 1 through 8 with Arc and Errol were, I wouldn't say necessarily like lower stakes, but some of the conflicts were mostly like internal conflicts. There was some tension between the characters, but it never really like blew over into full on arguments or anything like that. It was a lot of like personal growth and trying to work through like major changes in your life and things like that. Once we jumped to chapter 9, it was like I felt like, even writing it out, the pacing just kind of went a lot faster. I don't know, Kat, is that how you felt about it?
I didn't feel like the pacing was going faster
Mhm.
as much. I do feel like we got to see inside, you know, their lives a little more of these
Mm.
new characters that we're getting introduced to.
Mhm.
I guess there were kind of like sort of time skips here and there. Um but I don't know. I feel it, and it might just be because, you know, it's a difference between 8 chapters versus, I can't do math. 16 chapters.
Mhm.
So there, even if I guess it feels like we're spending a lot more time with this group of characters, but this is literally just, you know, there's twice as many chapters. So
It's true, yeah, and in terms of, like, the time scale of things, this second part of Level 0 is over the course of a couple months,
mhm,
whereas, chapters 1 through 8 were a few weeks, something along those lines, so
yeah,
a lot more time has passed as well. I think the world got a little bit bigger as well, it's no longer the small, little, secluded temple by the mountains, it's now,
yeah.
like, this big, sprawling city with, universities and markets and, all of these things.
Yeah, and you introduced that pretty early on too, like Laurel having, you know, like talking about like needing money for a teleportation circle to get down for another play showing.
Yeah, yeah. I was like, it's interesting thinking about like the world of New Everlon now that you bring it up. They have these kind of anachronistic things going on. They have essentially like teleportation subway stations, but
Yeah.
also we're still in like I would say like the equivalent of like 1800s colonial America
Yeah,
kind of thing.
it feels like very like early industrial age.
Right, right.
Like that's where I feel in time is like very pre early like industrial era.
Mhm.
But with magic, and it's really cool.
Yeah, it's really fun being able to build up these worlds. In a way, it feels like from scratch because, well, I really didn't want to go with the medieval setting again for Dungeons and Dragons.
Mhm.
I think those are just a little bit overplayed, so I wanted to go with something just a little bit more modern.
Yeah. I especially like it too because like so much of D&D, like if you think about it, a lot of D&D is very like almost post-apocalyptic in a lot
Mm,
of it, because like, you know, you're constantly like, or you're delving through these old ancient ruins from like a civilization that doesn't exist anymore, and we're not really
right.
doing any of that in this story. So I kind of like it. It's a new fresh take and a new fresh setting.
Oh, good. I'm glad. I do sort of like the feel of New England style little town feels
Hmm.
to all of it, but we still have like what makes D&D kind of special with all the different like races and still the sort of multicultural aspect of it. I'm glad you're enjoying the new world that we have here. All right, let's see. I kind of wanted let's see how we can structure this. I'm thinking about going through like character after character because we do have a slightly larger cast this
Hmm.
time around. Um, so we're gonna start with Bach. The reason I wanted to start with him is I don't know if anyone's looking at all of my like different accounts at this point, but I have a lot of profile pictures because of these different accounts. And one recurring thing is Box seems to be the profile picture of all of my accounts. I mentioned earlier we have like a tier system, and
Hmm.
I'm using the tier system as like, separating out the different quote unquote books of the Outlanders journey. In Dungeons and Dragons, there's 4 tiers, and I have 4 main characters. And so I wanted to use each tier and have like one kind of spotlight character. So, the short answer is why is Bach used for all of my profile pictures? Because Bach is the main character of Tier 1. His story of wanting to journey home and rediscover the world out there when he was kind of robbed of that experience as a child becomes the kind of central driving narrative of all of Tier 1.
Hmm.
So, that's why he's currently the spotlight character.
Yeah. I think it's really good to have a character like Bach as that sort
Mhm.
of spotlight character for a tier like this too, because he's been so sheltered. Well, sheltered, abused. We'll get into that,
Mhm.
but he's been so sheltered. So a lot of what we're gonna see in the story is gonna be very new for Bach, where it might not necessarily be for Laurel and the
Exactly.
others. Um,
Yeah.
and so especially when, that plus narrating in second person is really cool for me because it gives me an opportunity to be like, you're experiencing this thing for the first time, and this is what, this new thing that you're experiencing is like.
Yeah, yeah. And I also want for, as I was writing the later chapters, he approaches the world in a very different way
Mhm.
as well. He sees the world in a different way, which is, someone like Laurel who's already kind of jaded, already kind of anti-authoritarian in a way, whereas Bach
Yeah.
is sort of still new to all of these different concepts. He's like a fresh little baby approaching the world. Now diving into the story of Bach, the relationship he had with Professor Sanos,
Mhm.
it's obviously there's like elements of physical abuse because he's being forced to like train and like,
Mhm.
all of that stuff. But a lot of the abuse ends up being like this very like psychological. His memories are constantly being altered.
Yeah.
The abuse comes from the fact that he's just isolated for, hours of the day, and the only person he gets to talk to is Professor Sanos, and it creates this effect of like he ends up looking forward to talking to his abuser
Yeah.
because that's the only kind of interaction he gets to have all day.
Even I think too, like, he's Professor Sanos, but to Bach he's Mr. Sanos. And
Yes.
that's a really like something that I thought was a really interesting dynamic in, especially in the way this story is told, is we get to see how Bach sees Professor Sanos versus how Laurel sees Professor Sanos.
Right.
And then over time, those two like variant perspectives sort of merge into one as Laurel sort of realizes what a monster Mr. Sanos is.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was a really interesting dynamic, I thought.
Yes, yes. And one thing I wanted to do with not just Bach but also with Maya Lee is, they're basically these like wild magic users,
Hmm.
and it becomes clear eventually that like essentially Professor Sanos is using them as like these little experiments
Yep.
for his own research purposes. It ties in a little bit with not necessarily the experimentation part, but the whole fact that, like, part of American history, including Canadian history, includes like capturing and kidnapping native children and
Yeah.
like isolating them and like basically keeping them captive from their homes and their
Hmm.
their their families and things like that.
Yeah, I also think there's an element of like trying to
Mhm.
trying to impose order on, something that is, inherently chaotic. Like a lot of Professor Sanos's justification for what he's trying to do is like he's trying to force Maya Lee and Bach to be able to control their wild magic, and it just
Mhm.
doesn't work that way, my guy.
Yeah.
Like I'm sorry, but this doesn't work that way. You can't force a square peg through a round hole like that. But that's what
Exactly.
Professor Sanos does, and that's what a lot of like Western colonizers did
Yeah.
and continue to do.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, it's funny you call it wild magic and it's like chaos, the embodiment of chaos, and it doesn't
Hmm.
like register in his head that you can't control this. I think it was important, when I was writing this section, it was originally just going to be Bach and Laurel, those two characters, and eventually like discovering each other and, escaping and stuff like that. But I realized at some point that like Bach needed another person there to
Yeah.
sort of drive his own internal motivations to want to leave, because otherwise it would have just been like Bach and Laurel find each other on some whim and somehow Laurel's able to convince Bach to do a complete 180 in like 5 minutes, kind of thing.
Mhm.
So the inclusion of Miley became very important pretty early on in writing out this story. Like she, one, was just a second person that Bach got to talk to during the day. Like Bach
Mhm.
finally had like a real friend who wasn't, his abuser.
Right.
And just being able to have somebody else there getting new perspectives from her was just like the catalyst that was needed for his like perception of things to change a little bit. And
Mhm.
then eventually, like, the meeting of Laurel was able to sort of bring everything, like, move everything forward in a more natural way. But I think having, like, a little girl like Miley there who's, very precocious and herself kind of rebellious was really important.
Mhm. I also think it's really cool in that, like, Miley is definitely younger than Bach by a lot, but
Mhm.
Bach has been there so long, and is so psychologically stunted basically
Mhm.
that, Bach is almost like the younger child.
Yeah.
Compare in contrast with Maya Lee, who knows a lot more about, like, oh, yeah, we should be trying to escape this situation we're in isn't right. We need to be trying to get back to the forest where both of us are from.
Yeah, exactly. Like Miley, who's 12 years old, has that concept wrapped around her head, and Baku's just been here for so long. Like his sense of like what is normal anymore is so warped at this
Yeah.
point. I really enjoy writing in Bach's perspective. Some of the more interesting things I get to do is like play a little bit with language because he does use a more like childish vocabulary.
Hmm.
It will change a little bit. I'm not going to keep him like, he has a low intelligence score, but I don't necessarily intend to keep him like forever like stunted like this.
Yeah.
Once he's out in the world, he's going to like grow a lot more. He's going to mature pretty quickly. But it is fun at this point to be able to write in his perspective and sort of tell the story with a slightly more like childish leaning voice. This in, contrast to Laurel or even like Errol or Ark's perspectives, which feel a little bit more like mature and adult by comparison.
One thing that I, really like about Bach in particular, uh or I guess something that I guess I feel like I relate to. Bach has this constant fear of, like, not wanting to hurt other people, right?
Mm,
Um, and I know, like, in the climax, there was one line in particular, and I'm trying to find it now. But Bach is saying to Laurel, like, "Oh, it's okay if you don't come with us. I don't want to hurt you again."
mm-hmm,
I don't know. It's just it's something that feels very relatable.
mm,
I guess as a trans woman, we're constantly, depicted in media and everything else as these, like, evil monsters, right? And
right.
it's it's very easy to internalize a lot, and it's something that, I've dealt with. A lot of trans women that I'm friends with, deal with this, like, internalized, fear that we're going to be the monster everyone thinks we are.
Mm,
And it's a it's really stressful, but it's something that, for me as a reader, I can see Bach dealing with that and relate to it myself.
right. Yeah. And, this is part of what makes the abuse so horrible
Yeah.
because, like, obviously, by every account, he's a very gentle spirit. He's very loving and he
Hmm.
just wants to be friends with everybody. And his constant fear is that he doesn't deserve these kinds of things because he thinks of himself as a monster when really, the monster is actually Professor Sanos, who's been
Yeah.
feeding this kind of narrative into his head. And like, yes, I think I did want some element of the wild magic to feel a little bit dangerous, but
Hmm.
I think it's not so much this idea of like, well, wild magic is just wild magic. It's just chaos. And
Yeah.
chaos is a neutral thing. It's not necessarily like this evil, horrible violent thing. It's just a neutral thing that exists in this world. and
Yep.
some people have it, and that's all it is. All right, let's move on to Laurel, the second character whose perspective we occupy quite a bit of. The section of this story opens with Laurel giving a little performance, and eventually, by some amount of like dumb luck, winding up back in the very place that he was trying to get out of.
Mm-hmm.
So Laurel was also a very interesting character for me to write. When I first wrote him, I didn't really know what to do with this character, to be completely honest. I had a lot of trouble figuring out like where to go with this character. I knew this character was a changeling. I knew that like the fact that he was, hiding his identity was kind of a big deal, but it wasn't until I brought in the rest of the world, and by world I mean like the whole politics of the changeling race in general and how they relate to New Everlon, that Laurel as a character became a little bit more clear. Originally it was just like, oh, Laurel's just a paranoid person for no reason. And
Mm-hmm.
then it became, oh no, Laurel is like this because there's an entire like oppression of changelings going
Yep.
on in New Everlon, and this is just a reflection of the way like he's had to survive in this kind of society.
Yeah, there was one scene in particular that I think really sticks out to me, and that's Laurel's last interaction with Amena,
Mm-hmm.
where Laurel is thinking like, what if I just dropped my disguise right now?
Yeah.
No, I couldn't do that because that would just make this even worse than it already is.
Yeah.
So while we're having this moment of like, I'm coming clean about everything, there's still this one thing that I have to keep a secret because
Exactly. Yeah. Because if he shows that to her, it's pretty much over for him. Like
yeah,
his entire life could be in danger by doing such a thing. Whereas he at this point gets to just walk away and be known as the asshole to Amena.
yeah,
I wanted to bring in like this sort of failed romance with Amena because I wanted to really bring in this whole idea of like Laurel, as a result of this kind of upbringing and this kind of oppression, is basically unable to form any sort of meaningful relationships with other people. This
hmm,
fact that he's hiding himself will always be something that eats away at him in a way where he's like, I just can't be a real person to anyone. I'm not a real person at all. I'm just this faker who's walking around pretending all the
yeah,
time. Which is why Laurel also found acting to be such like to be a place where he could feel a little bit better about himself, because he gets to be like, oh, well, I'm pretending as an actor, but everyone knows I'm pretending and everyone wants to see me pretending and everyone's going to be applauding me for pretending. And it
hmm,
that was sort of his avenue of release at one point before he realized he's not making any money doing this.
right. And of course the the trans themes are very there.
Mhm. Yep.
um
Yeah, and it's interesting to write about changelings because if there was no like oppression from New Everlon,
yeah,
the changeling race and their relationship with gender would be so different from how it is now. At this point, the way that it operates is like, okay, you're born and you or your parents pick what gender you're going to be for the rest of your life, and you're just going to play that for the rest of your life, even though gender identity as a concept for them was, it's very different from like how we see gender. For
hmm.
them it's like, oh, I can change my gender whenever I want. So it's almost like, changing out of your clothes kind of thing.
I guess I don't know. Maybe I just had a different reaction reading this story, but
Mhm.
I got a sense, at least from the conversations between Laurel and Elithor, that
Mhm.
like at least in Laurel's family, like no, they expect Laurel to be Elise. Like
Yes.
Elithor was very casually disparaging, like, oh, you're gallivanting around as a man. This is lunacy, and
Yeah.
it's like, screw off, Elithor. Who asked you?
Yes, exactly. And that does bring into like there are some unspoken but explicit still rules within changeling community or
Mhm.
changeling society, which is like changelings have their own sets of like laws with each other where they're like, okay, you can't change your gender identity, you can't change your gender expression. Generally speaking, try not to change your race as well. And like there's all these like little rules, and it's almost like this sort of like self-policing. I don't know if that's the right word to use to describe it, but like they there's certain things that like for them there's a line that you cannot cross, and there's Laurel just kind of crossing these lines, which is just like Illithor was just like, "Oh my god, I can't believe you're doing this."
Yeah, there's a lot of there's sort of an underlying, conflict of like, in the trans community we have people who go stealth versus
Mm,
people who, are out and loud and proud, like yours
yes.
truly.
Uh-huh.
Um and yeah, it's very, very, different. It's kind of a lot of what we see, like, Laurel is in this community, this family that expects him to be stealth,
Mhm.
whereas that's not what he wants to be. He wants to be out. He wants people to know who he is,
Yeah.
but he also lives in a world where he can't necessarily, because if people knew who he really was, then he's going to be the next the next example of the changeling panic defense getting used,
Yes,
which
exactly.
we can assume exists in this world.
Yes, definitely. Definitely. Yeah, it's I have less experience with like the trans community, but some of this the community aspects were things that I brought in from my own upbringing in like a Chinese American community growing up in the
Hmm.
Midwest. It's one of those things where like I have this very like I have this very vivid memory of there was some stupid fight that broke out in my middle school, and like me and a couple of people like stepped in to try to intervene and break up that fight. And then I told my mom about it afterwards, and my mom like yelled at me. She was just like, "I cannot believe you tried to intervene on that. You should have just run away or walked away from that, because the moment you like intervene and you like make yourself known is the moment that you as like a Chinese American girl are going to get like a target on you." And I was like, that's that's a really weird and paranoid thing for you to believe, kind of
Hmm.
thing. And as a kid, I was just like, why are you saying this? This makes no sense. Watching sort of the panic that unfolded as a result of, COVID and all that stuff, and all of these sort of anti Chinese rhetoric that came out, it was one of those things where it's like, yes, we are perpetual foreigners, and the goodwill that has been extended to Chinese Americans is very dependent on how well we can be the quote unquote model minority,
Hmm.
which is something I wanted to bring in a little bit with the changeling community. They are very much trying to be the most upstanding citizens within
Right.
New Everlon. They want to be as, like square as possible and doing like very respectable work that also doesn't make them very visible. Um,
Hmm.
and for Laurel, he resents his family and his community very much for forcing that upon him, but at the same time, like, the only reason that they're doing this is because they don't want to die. They don't want to have to be at the mercy of New Everlon deciding, oh, we gotta find all the changelings and and identify them again.
Yeah.
So there's like kind of the way like Laurel experiences it is like there's basically like for him two levels of oppression that he's going through. One from like the larger like changeling community that he feels stifled by, but he doesn't necessarily see the next level, which is that like, well, the reason they're imposing these things is because New Everlon is basically forcing their hand, kind
Yeah.
of thing. And he's unable to, at this point, really understand that, like, Illithor's doing these things because he thinks this is how he protects Laurel. Illithor is like, I'm just trying to, like, keep you safe. You're, like, out here in the city and you're, like, as you say, gallivanting as a man. Like, you're gonna be caught. and I'm gonna lose a sibling this way.
Yeah.
So it's a complicated thing.
It definitely is. It's definitely something that I know, anybody who's trans who's
Hmm.
reading this story is probably going to either be able to relate to with their own experience, or from other trans friends that they'll have like this. There's this thing that constantly happens between Laurel and Elithor where Elithor is just like casually like dead naming and being transphobic to
Hmm.
Laurel, while Laurel is there, like, being like, "Please, I just need your help." Like,
Yeah.
and it's just like Elithor doesn't even think of it as like, "Oh yeah, I'm twisting the knife while I'm doing this." By the way, because
Yeah.
from Elithor's perspective, like, no, you're just supposed to be Elise. Like, you're just being stupid and silly. What even is this? Whereas Laurel's like, "Hey, again, screw off, Elithor.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, can you just not? Can you just not for like 5 minutes?"
Yeah. Yeah. And like the relationship between Laurel and Illithor is very complicated because,
Mhm.
on the one hand they do love each other, and
Right.
I think part of what Laurel deeply resents in Illithor is that like it, there's hints that like Illithor went through the same exact shit, you
Yep.
know? Um Illithor also is going through the same kind of like gender dysphoria and all of that kind of stuff. He's just forcing it away, and he's like, I'm still a man. This is what I decided to be, and now that I'm a grown up and I've matured, I've gone past that weird teenage rebellious phase. That's how he's basically framing this whole thing with himself. He's like, "Oh, I moved past this. I'm fine now." Kind of thing, and
Mm.
he's looking down at Laurel as a result.
Spoiler alert, he's not fine.
He's not. Yeah, and it's very difficult for Laurel because Laurel sees this as a betrayal. Laurel sees this as like, you're the only person I thought who could like understand this, but
Mhm.
instead you've completely taken, our parents' side, and you're just spouting the same kind of stuff back at me when, at one point in our relationship like we understood each other.
Yeah.
And it's also one of those things where like it's again also hinted at, but like Laurel was always seen as like the more gifted one within the
Mhm.
family, whereas Illithor was like, he's employed and he's working a respectable job, but he's also like a delivery driver, which is not
Yeah.
necessarily something that can be compared to like going to the MIT of New Everlon. So there's also some amount of like resentment there where Illithor gets to be like, "Oh, wow, look at you struggling. Look at you like not being able to make it, and like look at me in comparison who has his life together compared to you." There's some amount of like that also
Yeah.
going on. There's a lot of just like, envy and resentment towards, on both sides.
Yeah. And that is a really common thing in the
Yeah.
in the trans community as well. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
Resentment and repression and envy, and yeah, I'm friends. I'm friends with tons of trans people at this point.
Mhm.
Especially a lot of trans women.
Mhm.
And this is something you see constantly where trans girl will post a, cute selfie and she'll have people in her
Mm.
mentions being like, "Oh, I'm so depressed that I'll never look as good as you." And it's like, oh,
Oh.
you don't need to be putting that on other people actually.
Yeah.
Like that's something for you to work on, sweetheart, not for you to.
Yeah. Yeah, and just kind of like ap impose that on somebody else
Yeah.
who's, trying to post a cute selfie and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I see it a lot as well, and it's also something like I see sort of reflected in all sorts of other communities as well. The trans community, but I also see it a lot again in like the Chinese American or greater Asian American community as well.
Mhm.
Changelings, in the way I wrote them, it's not just like a gender identity thing, but it's also like very much like a racial identity. And
Yeah.
I wanted this to be like this interesting intersection of experiences here.
I think it comes across great.
Okay, good. I was a little bit nervous when I first decided to write about like the gender elements of changelings, even though it's kind of a given. Because, like, originally, like I said, it was just Laurel. There was no like community or greater society aspect. There was no like oppression of changelings going on, things like that. But I was like, I think I have to put it in because it just makes sense
Yeah.
for this kind of society. And we'll get into it a little bit later when we talk about New Everlon and the way elves see changelings. But yeah, it was just one of those things I wanted to really bring in. One interesting thing I realized as I was writing Laurel was that like Laurel having internalized a lot of negative things about himself has this tendency to really self-punish as a result of, imposter syndrome, like internalized transphobia, all of these things. He has this tendency like he got expelled from the school
Yep.
and his brother was like, you can just reapply. Why can't you just reapply? And then Laurel was like, no, I'm not going to reapply. I've already failed. There's no point in me going back to this school, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And like Laurel basically closes a lot of doors on himself because he just feels like he's not good enough to sort of keep going.
Yeah. It's there's so many things with Laurel that I just find so deeply relatable, you know? It's especially that like self I don't want to say Laurel has like a martyr complex, but Laurel very much is a kind of character who he doesn't value his own life
Mhm.
over being willing to sacrifice his either his life or himself for other people.
Mhm.
You especially see this a lot towards the end when he's trying to break out Bach and Miley. Like he didn't have to do that.
Yeah.
He's just, and I'm glad he did. Laurel's got a really good moral compass, but also like Laurel definitely didn't have to do that.
Yeah.
He didn't have to put himself in as much risk as he was doing,
Mhm.
and he chose to. And sometimes that's a good thing. It's good to be willing to give to other people,
Mhm.
but it can, it can get you into trouble when you're like, oh, I'm going to literally put my life on the line all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And like one thing I wanted to convey, I don't know how successfully, is like it's not necessarily like a savior complex. It's not like he's a shonen protagonist who wants to like, I don't know, be the next Hokage and like all of that stuff. Like Laurel's doing this because he doesn't value his own life.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. It
Yeah.
it it very much comes across like a my life is meaningless, so it's worth nothing if I die and
Yeah.
someone else is and somebody else is helped out,
It,
or
yeah,
yeah,
exactly. He just
very very little self-preservation instincts.
Exactly. Exactly. Which does lead me to the next character I want to talk about with Xenos.
Mhm. Such a fun villain. Oh
Oh
my
man,
god.
I had such a great time writing him. Again, he didn't exist in my early drafts of like Bach and Laurel. It was very much more like running away from like the institution, the school and stuff.
Yeah.
But I was like, oh, I need a face to this. I need a face that kind of represents this school. So Xenos comes in, and one thing I wanted to write with him is, how there's that whole thing about like villains you want to like instill fear of the villain kind of thing. And
Yep.
obviously like all of the characters are terrified of Xenos. But one thing I really wanted to like convey is that like Xenos really, really needs to be loved. He needs for people to like genuinely worship him. And it's not necessarily just like they're because they're fearful of him, although he will throw in like threats and stuff like that. He wants people to like genuinely be loyal to him and respect him, kind of thing.
Mhm.
He wants them to like believe in this cause that he's working towards.
Yeah, he You mentioned the idea of a savior complex earlier,
Mhm.
and he's almost got that to the extent that, like, especially in his relationship with Bach, where he's like, look at how much I've done for you. Don't, this is how you repay me
Yeah.
for all of these years of uh, physical abuse, mental abuse, emotional abuse, identity wiping. Like,
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
a freaking monster! Oh my goodness.
In his eyes, he thinks he's, like, genuinely helping, and he's, like,
Hmm.
genuinely trying to save, like, "This is my son, I'm trying to save my son." And I'm glad that, like, at the very least, like, Laurel was able to see past it pretty quick.
He was able to see past it. One thing that I think was interesting to me
Mhm.
is how well Sanos's, like, manipulation tactics worked on Laurel too.
Mhm. It's
Um
true.
so like, you get, pretty much from the start of Laurel and Sanos's relationship, like, Sanos is more or less grooming Laurel.
Yeah.
And it kind of turns into this thing, especially, later on when they finally, when Sanos discovers that Laurel is a changeling and they have that confrontation. And Laurel brings up the idea of, like, reporting Sanos to the authorities, and Sanos is like, they all know what I'm doing. They all know about this. This is all above board.
Yeah.
If you try to report me, you're just going to be, bringing down more problems on yourself, you filthy, disgusting changeling. And it's like, that's that's something we never find out if that's true or not. Like, that's
Mhm.
never actually verified. Laurel just kind of believes that, like,
Mhm.
because Sanos has positioned himself as this, like, all-powerful figure over Laurel's life at this point.
Yep.
Was Sanos telling the truth? I don't know. Dude's a pathological liar. He's lying all the time. That could have been, like, he could have gone down if Laurel reported him,
Yeah, it's true.
but we'll never know. And he's dead now, so
Yes.
screw him anyway.
Yeah, that's a really good point because it's like, yeah, on the one hand, Laurel was able to sort of like eventually piece together that Xenos is, a monster, but he still bought into a lot of the narratives that Xenos fed him.
Yep.
There were a lot of things that he was like, oh yeah, it's true. Yeah, I'm not going to question that kind of thing.
Yeah. That's such a, like, thing with, abusive relationships and dynamics, is this idea that, like, oh, nothing you could do will stop the abuser, right?
Mhm.
And they make you believe. I'm someone, I'm speaking from experience. I was in
Mhm.
a, abusive relationship for a long time, which I'm thankfully not in anymore.
Good.
But yeah, it turns into this situation where, they become this person in your mind where nothing, you are powerless to stop them.
Yeah.
So it was have I mentioned that I really relate to Laurel? I feel like I'm like a broken record. Laurel's probably, like, my favorite character, I think, in the story at this point.
Good, good. Laurel was a lot of fun to write, and I think like the fact that he's like very earnestly trying so hard to operate and survive and all of that stuff. But yeah, with like Xenos, it's like I have a similar experience with like abusive relationships where it's like part of what makes it so convincing is how respected or charismatic they are in some
Yep.
abusive cases where it's like, oh, all of your, like, you see the way they interact with their friends, you see the way they
Yep.
interact with their family, and it's sort of like, oh, if I say anything, no one's gonna believe me because everyone loves them.
Yeah.
And it's like it really does emphasize that idea of like, I'm alone in this, only I'm experiencing this and I can't do anything about it. One thing I will say, like, Sanos, in writing him, what ultimately led to his downfall, like this fundamental flaw that he had, was I think his conception of human relationships is ultimately short sighted because the way that
Yeah.
he sets up his relationships is like he's going to like convince you of this like great thing that he's doing, and he's going to like incentivize you with like good pay, quote unquote, and like he's going to give you opportunities and open doors for you and all of that stuff. And like he basically positions himself, you know, that whole like savior complex. He sees himself as someone who's like genuinely trying to like help you. He has this very like paternalistic view of
Mhm.
himself compared to everybody else. Like he doesn't really hire high elves. We haven't really met that many other employees of him besides Anon.
Yeah.
But like with the case of Anon, like he hired this little like Harrington boy, and he was just like, I'm gonna like bring you in and I'm going to like show you the ways. And like basically the relationship he has with Anon is like perfect for him because Anon worships him. Anon
Yep.
is never going to question him. He's going to like work overtime and do all these extra labor for Sanos
Yep.
because Anon is just like, well, Sanos saved my life, Sanos saved my family, you know, all of
Yep.
that stuff. And so
It doesn't matter how badly everyone here is mistreating me,
yeah,
because it's
it's
okay.
okay because, you know, at the end of the day, I'm going to this prestigious school and I get to have all these opportunities, and Sanos loves me as a result, you know, all of that stuff. And like Sanos sees himself doing that with everybody. With Bach, it's a lot more abusive, obviously, but at the same time, like
Mhm.
he wouldn't be erasing Bach's memories if he didn't want Bach to still love him. And he ultimately has this very like transactional relationship with everybody. Where he went wrong was ultimately with Laurel because he underestimated Laurel's ability to just go fuck it.
Yep.
He forgot that like sometimes when you push someone too far into a corner, that person on top of like fight or flight, there's also the fuck it mentality.
Yep. Sometimes people don't have self-preservation instincts, Professor Thanos.
Exactly. Did you realize that, Mr. Sanos? So that was ultimately what led to his downfall because Laurel was no longer somebody he could like control or predict. And
Mhm.
towards the end, the same thing was happening with Bach. He couldn't really control Bach anymore either, and that was where everything started like falling apart for him.
And oh, he just gets so deliciously deranged towards the end. Just speaking as a voice actress,
Mhm.
like, just it's so fun getting to play deranged villains. Like, I I very much when I've been voicing Professor Thanos, like in my head, I'm thinking of a character that's like Scar from The Lion
Oh
King, someone who's
yeah.
just like drips this like malicious like evilness, and he can be cool and collected, but he can also just be like mad, insane, and deranged,
Yeah.
and it's just he's so fun.
I wanted Sanos to somewhat represent, even though at the end of the day, he's just one professor within a powerful institution, and this institution is just one school within, you know, this big country called New Everlon. I wanted him to sort of represent how far like a nation like New Everlon is willing to go, which, you know, serves as a
Mhm.
little bit of foreshadowing. Who knows? New Everlon as a nation, I wanted them to feel like this very powerful nation that they can do whatever they want at this point. There's hints at this. This will be like an overarching thing that'll come about starting at level 1 and beyond, but like New Overland has
Mhm.
sort of politically positioned themselves to be like they have control over this territory called Harrington, and they're also encroaching into the forest where Ark and Errol are, and they have a lot of political sway over, you know, the Aarakocra and all of that stuff. And this is something that you're going to see play out once we get to the forest.
Yeah, there's a lot of like manifest destiny going
Oh
on
yeah.
with New Everlon.
Yeah, yeah, that was one of the things I really wanted to connect to. The geography of this continent is very much reminiscent of North America, and
Mhm.
where they are currently situated is basically like District of Columbia, except I call it BC instead of DC.
Wait, what is the B?
Oh, it stands for Bay of Corallon.
Okay, okay, okay.
So instead of naming it after Columbia, they've named it after their god Corallon. One thing about New Everlon that kind of makes them a little bit different from the United States is that their geography is a lot smaller. They are only sort of taking up like the southern half of
Yeah.
the East Coast. And one aspect of like, United States history is that like it was 13 colonies who were very culturally different from each other. It was comprised of like a lot of different groups of people who came to America for different reasons.
Many
Like,
of them unwillingly.
yeah, but in the case of New Everland, they do present a much more united front than the 13 original colonies. They have they are much more like Zionists.
Yeah.
they have they have a very specific like religiosity to what they're doing. Like they're kind of powered by some of the ideals of Coralon, and they have this idea of like, oh, we are like the chosen people of this continent and we're going to take it over from coast to coast,
Hmm.
which, the United States did the same exact stuff, but like I think New Everland is able to sort of do this a lot faster and a lot more on like a united front
Yeah, well, having
than
magic, I think, probably.
yeah, maybe a little magic helps.
Like having
Yeah,
stuff like teleportation circles makes makes things a lot easier.
it makes travel just a tad faster, right? And with magic it just makes things so much stronger for them,
Hmm.
which is why I had to just slightly nerf things for now.
Hmm.
What was hinted at by Senos during one of his many monologues, there's this sort of belief that elves can actually live for hundreds of years, unlike how we do right now, which, they live normal human length lives. And also,
Yeah.
elves can go without sleep. And they're very intrigued by this idea, which is part of the reason why they like came to this continent in the first place, because apparently there's other elves in this continent, and these other elves seem to have tapped into this way of living that is superior. So there's this sort of like pseudo, not even pseudo at this point, but like this fascistic
Hmm.
ideology underlying all of it, that they're like this sort of chosen race of people, and they're coming back here to reclaim their homeland, and they're going to tap into this like potential within all of them kind of thing.
Uh-huh.
But, for the time being, the high elves of New Everland, they only live normal human-like lives, and they still have to sleep. And because these elves are very new, they came to the continent only like 100 or 200 years ago. They're still discovering new magic. So at this point, their magic system goes up to about level 5 spells,
Hmm.
and it doesn't go past that for now. Who knows? Who knows how far they're able to take it? But at this point, they're like still discovering magic, and like level 5 is roughly the limit that they're at right now. I think it's also worth mentioning. I don't know if you see this at all on Twitter, Cap, but there's always like discourse that comes up over like, is it okay to depict racism and oppression in like D&D and high fantasy? To which my answer is always yes, why not?
Yeah.
But a couple of points have been made about this idea, which is like if you have like this very clear like this fantasy race equals this real race in our world, it ends up kind of opening up this huge like Pandora's box in a way,
Yeah.
because it's like, oh, well, if this fantasy race has this quality, are you stereotyping as a result?
Yeah, and I know one of the issues, especially in D&D, and I know the
Mhm.
Wizards of the Coast, they've been trying to move away from this, and other games and
Yeah.
systems like tackle this in their own way. That like there's this idea that like all of these different races are themselves a
Mhm.
monoculture, which is like, and you get this in so many stories. So like take D&D out of it, this is a issue. Like you could look at something like Star Trek. Let's go completely like
Mhm.
opposite end. In Star Trek, that was an issue all the time, where like you have this like cool multicultural like you know cast and crew on the ship, but then you go to this planet and it's like an entire planet is a monoculture. That
Yeah.
probably that seems kind of weird.
Yeah.
Real life doesn't work like that. Monoculture is like People are diverse.
Yes.
Societies contain multitudes.
Yes, yes. And you do bring a good point, like, a lot of times, like, fantasy and sci-fi, they especially when it's, written by white people, sometimes they don't do a great job of, like, depicting some of the nuances and stuff like that. But I don't think that means that
Mhm.
you should like throw a blanket statement of like no racism allowed in sci-fi fantasy kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think only like the most like extreme opinions would like state this kind of stuff, but it was something that I was a little worried about. Where I'm like, okay, I'm like being pretty explicit here about like there is pretty bad oppression and racism going on here. I'm not going to be writing like a world in which I don't know, the orcs and the elves all live peacefully and happily together kind of thing.
Yeah. I think it's basically, it's a question of, are you depicting racism or are you being racist
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good
in
point.
your depictions of like different people?
Yeah, yeah, which hopefully I'm not, I don't know. I'm trying very hard not to be, and
I think you're doing a great job.
okay, I'll take it, I'll take
I'm
it.
a white person saying that, so
I've had a couple of sensitivity readers who've also said they thought I did a good job. But yeah, I like one thing like, you know, I didn't want for one to like make that sort of false equivalent of like, oh no, like
yeah,
one fantasy race equals one real life race. I don't think that's how I like to write races. I'd rather just write them as they are, kind of thing. So with the case of the changelings, it's like thinking almost from the ground up, like, okay, this is how changelings are, right? If, for example, the elves have this ideology of like elven supremacy, then there is nothing more threatening to the elves than a changeling who is able to,
yeah,
shapeshift into anything and anyone and basically completely obliterate this, idea of the elves being the superior race kind of thing. And
hmm
so that's why the changelings are oppressed and that's why the changelings have to form this kind of culture and this is why the changelings have had to adopt this sort of like lifestyle and belief system as a result. And then, with the elves, it's another one of those things where it's like, okay, in Dungeons and Dragons, the elves are by their lore and to some extent by their like the mechanics that you get if you choose to play an elf, you do have some quote unquote advantages when it comes to wielding magic kind of thing. That's why there's
yeah,
so many elf wizards.
hmm
But that also leads to potentially the elves seeing themselves as the superior race because they're like, oh, we're so naturally gifted at magic, so therefore we are the chosen people, kind of thing. And that's where that sort of like kind of fascisty ideology comes from, kind of thing. So I wanted to
yeah,
approach every race and like build them from as much of the ground up as possible.
yeah, and somewhere where I think you probably do it really well is, we have this idea, and it's something that probably parallels to like real world social dynamics. Um,
Hmm.
is, you have the pure elves versus the half elves, and you like touch on how like, half elves, they're elves, but they're still being mistreated because
Yeah.
they're not pure blood.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean that's very, true to life,
Yep.
and
Exactly. And, I'll bring in Errol because she is a black woman.
mhm,
She she would not do well in New Everlon if she went there
yeah,
because like it is also implied that like a lot of the like all of the elves and even the half elves are, they're light skinned. And even though there are like humans and stuff like that, Errol stepping foot in New Everlon would not bode very well for her,
right,
which is why she's never been to New Everlon. There's also, at this point, I have implied the existence of slavery within New Everlon, but we don't
mhm,
necessarily know what that looks like yet. So it may or may not come up soon at some point.
yeah,
But yeah, this is like I'm slowly building out sort of the racial dynamics of this this world, and there's we're going to be introduced to a lot more other races once we hit like level 1 and stuff like that. These characters have barely stepped out of their homes. All right. Is there anything else you wanted to go over? I'm just going through my notes.
Yeah, no, I think we covered pretty much everything I wanted to talk about. I'm excited to, keep narrating into the second arc. I've been having, I can't say this enough how much fun I've been having with this
Good.
story. I've been really connecting to it and
Mhm.
all the different characters, and I love doing all the voice.
Mhm.
We were talking about Elithor earlier, and I loved,
Oh,
the
yes.
accent that you had me do for Elithor. Yeah, and I tried to do that with Laurel too, like, because I know in the character notes you gave me, like, you were like, Laurel is trying to mask their accent. So what I would generally do, and I
Mhm.
especially did this in chapter 25, is when Laurel is talking to people like Bach or Miley, Laurel just sounds like he normally does.
Mhm.
But when he's talking to Elithor, when he's talking, when he gets on the sending stone to talk to his parents, like that accent, like
Yep.
immediately starts like,
I noticed that too.
becoming more prominent. I grew up in the South. I don't think I really have like this is something that like I relate to
Yeah.
is masking a Southern accent. I grew up in Tennessee, and I just I never wanted to have a Southern
Yeah.
accent just because like I associate Southern accents with
Right.
certain things that I think a lot of us do that are probably negative because I have bad interactions
Mhm.
with people in Tennessee who have those
Mhm.
kinds of accents. But I also know like there was
Mhm.
someone I was dating who also kind of had that when we were together, they never spoke in a Southern accent, but as soon as they got on the phone with their family or their parents, Southern accent
Yeah.
immediately started
Yeah.
creeping in, and it was almost like an unconscious thing to like it's not like a conscious choice. It just sort of happens because
Yep.
it's, oh, this is the way I talk to my parents versus this is the way I talk to my friends and partners and stuff.
Yeah, yeah. It's definitely true. I've noticed like with a couple of my friends as well that like as soon as they're like back home, like with their like, childhood friends or with their family or something like that, like their voice changes a little bit or sometimes very
Mhm.
dramatically, and like I'll be like, "Oh, you sound so different." And they'll be like, "Oh, I didn't even realize it. I'm just so used to like
Yep.
talking this way with my family." Kind of thing. So I thought you did a really good job doing that with Laurel as well. It was really fun
Thank
to
you.
listen to that. I love the little code switching that you do.
Thanks. I don't know what else to say, but that's really high praise. I try to do a good job, so I'm just beaming over here right now.
I mean, what can I say? I mean, you're a really good voice actress.
Thank
And
you.
I really hope you get a lot more roles. It sounds like you're, doing more roles as well, right?
I did a couple auditions
Mhm.
recently. I'm got a couple of projects. One of them is one of the books that I'm going to recommend here in a second.
Ah, perfect.
I've got a couple of projects that let's be honest, I've kind of been putting off, but I've also kind of moved twice in the last
Mm,
year, so and
yeah.
quit jobs and started going to college, and now I dropped out of half of my college classes because I'm starting a new job. It's been a busy
It
year.
sounds like a very hectic year.
Yeah, I just submitted a couple auditions for like actual, professional union gigs. But I also have a couple
Hmm.
of like smaller projects that I want to get started on. I am supposed to be recording a personal audiobook copy of Neuromancer by William Gibson for one of my friends who really
Wow.
want she's like, "Kat, please do a recording of Neuromancer just for me
Oh,
specifically." And I was like, "Okay, I could probably get away with that."
that would be the perfect gift.
Yeah, no, and it's something I'm doing for her as, like, a gift because,
Yeah.
like, she likes my narrating, and
Aw.
it's one of her favorite books
Aw.
because yeah, so I've gotta get on that.
Awesome. Well, let's jump into it then. Like, we can move on to the media or, book, movie, TV, music, whatever recommendations. Kat, what are you recommending?
Well, the first thing I wanna recommend actually is a song that I
Mm.
just listened to this morning because there's a brand new music video. There's a song called Starship Velociraptor by the band Galacticraken, which is Jonathan Young's band. If anybody is familiar with who Jonathan Young is, he's one of my favorite singers.
That was so many very cool names that you said all at once. That was amazing.
Okay, so the song is called Starship Velociraptor, and it's just got the coolest music video. It just dropped like 3 days ago,
Mhm.
and it's like it's very like 90s anime cyberpunk. It's so cool, and it's a really good song. At least I think so. The band is called Galacticraken, which is just the coolest freaking name for a band ever. I'm sorry. And yeah, the lead singer's name is Jonathan Young. I also wanted to recommend another author. If anybody's looking for more stories to read, one of my best friends is Ella Bambust. She's on Twitter at Ella Me Maxima. She is the author of a bunch of great stories, one of which I'm actually going to be narrating.
Mm.
She's wanted me to narrate her some of her stories for a while, and she actually gave me the choice. So I picked my favorite story of hers that I'm going to be narrating, which is called "We're Not So Different, You and I."
Oh.
And it's also like kind of a cyberpunk. It deals with a lot of, Ella is a trans author,
Mhm.
and it's a story where you've got multiple different characters it's kind of like this one sort of, where you're constantly jumping from through multiple different characters perspectives, but it's basically
Mhm.
you've got these group of characters that get sucked through a portal into like a cyberpunk world, and it's really really cool, and just a lot of the themes of like figuring out your identity, figuring out your place in the world, lots of queer themes, lots of trans themes. It's a really
Mhm.
really good story, and it's my favorite one that Ella has written.
All right.
So yeah, the story is "We're Not So Different, You and I" by Ella, at Ella Me Maxima on Twitter. You can find her, you can tell her I said hi. That's it for my recommendations this time round.
Awesome. I will include links for all of these, so I'll have them in the description of
Hmm.
wherever you're listening to this. God, my recommendations. I was actually like stirring for a long time trying to like think of something to recommend. I just finished reading the Remembrance of Earth's Past book series, which is the Chinese trilogy by Cixin Liu. I think that's the pronunciation. Um he wrote the Three Body Problem as the first book, and it's about aliens and sci-fi, and it spans across an unfathomable amount of time. It's kind
Hmm.
of a wild ride. That was a really fun book to read. I was traveling recently and I was watching movies on the plane. One of the movies was Nomadland,
Okay.
directed by Chloe Zhao. That was a movie that I've been hearing about, but I never got the chance to watch it, and there it was on a plane. So
Hmm.
what else can you do? And it ended up being probably one of my favorite movies that I've watched recently.
Cool.
It's so if I could write the way that Chloe Zhao directs, I would be very happy with myself.
Yeah.
I love the way that the way that I think about writing is like, I'm a writer. I have my own like perspective and identity and my own like voice, right? But I have to channel that through like a filter known as, the narration filter, and then the narration filter has to channel their voice down to the character, right?
Right.
So the character is going to have a different voice than both the narration and from me, so
Hmm.
that there's like basically these like three layers of separation between me and ultimately the perspective character, right? The way that Chloe Zhao directs is there's just this perfect through line, basically. It feels very like pure the way that like connection between the three layers goes through.
Hmm.
And I wish I could write like that. I wish I could write in such a way that like it's very clear from me to, for example, like Laurel's perspective. I'm trying to say something, but I'm not trying to like say it explicitly. I'm trying to like voice it through a narration who's also trying to voice it through Laurel's like very unique perspective on the world. And it all ends up being this very clear like line. Like the themes, the character development, all of those things just run through in like lockstep
Mhm.
kind of thing. I wish I could write like that. Her perspective character is Fern. Fern is this woman who lost her husband a couple years ago, and she also lost her job during the 2008 recession, and so now she's living in a van and she's just driving around, not even trying to find, she's just traveling around, and she doesn't really want to form any like deep relationships with people. She's afraid of forming intimate relationships with other people. As soon as she feels like she gets too close, she leaves,
Mhm.
kind of thing. The experience you get watching this movie is sort of like you first start out just watching Fern, and then you eventually feel like you understand her, and then you feel like you know her, and then by the end I feel like I was her. So that was like just it was a very interesting kind of experience to go through that, to
Mhm.
feel like I've really stepped to the character. I wish I could write like that someday, but for now I get to sort of experience that with Nomadland.
Yeah.
So
That's really cool.
yeah. Awesome. Well, I think that covers everything today. We covered a lot of ground,
Mhm.
and the story at this point has just started. We've basically finished ostensibly the prologue of the Outlanders journey, so there's a lot of stuff
I'm so
coming your
excited.
way. So, yeah.
I have not been reading very far ahead, so, like, I'm kinda mostly reading this, like, as except for, I try to if I get introduced to a new character, I'll try to, like, read a little ahead to figure out more, who
Mhm.
is this character? Because
Yeah.
the worst thing that can happen as a narrator is you start, like, you start narrating this character, and you just kinda, like, pick a voice for them, and then, like, say 2, 3 chapters later, there's, like, some detail about, like,
Mm.
oh, in their Boston accent that they've had this whole time, and it's like, "Oh, no, what have I done?"
Oh. Luckily, you haven't done that. And I actually really enjoyed that you're narrating along generally with where you're also reading. It's very, very fun to sort of see that unfold. And, in our discussions, I know that you're never going to spoil beyond what we've, beyond where we are at. Well, awesome. It was really, really great talking to you again, Kat. I look forward to
Likewise.
more narrations from you.
We'll be back next week with the next 2 chapters of Tier 1, Level 1.
Yes, how exciting. We are on to the new level.
I'm gonna have to, because like, Tier 1, Level 0 is just, like, is a thing that it's, like, in my muscle memory. I'm gonna have to get used to saying Tier 1, Level 1 now.
Oh, yeah, yeah. It's like a new year, basically.
Mhm.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for chatting with me, Kat.
Yep, likewise.
I'll talk to you soon. Mhm.
Bye.
Bye.